You're a disappointment and a failure. I no longer consider you my daughter. Those were the last words my father said to me before he walked out of my life 5 years ago. Yesterday, he called me from the hospital, desperately needing $175,000 for his stepdaughter's emergency surgery, a procedure his new family couldn't afford, but I now had the means to provide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The manila envelope sat untouched on my kitchen counter for 3 days. The return address belonged to my father's law firm, Blackwell & Associates, a place I'd visited exactly once when I was 16. That day, Dad had proudly introduced me to his colleagues, his hand on my shoulder, voice brimming with that particular tone parents use when showcasing their children's achievements. Alexandra's going to be a surgeon someday, he'd told them, with absolute certainty. Top of her class in science. Now, at 28, I was neither a surgeon nor top of any class. The envelope likely contained documents finalizing what had been made verbally clear during our last conversation 5 years ago. I was no longer his daughter in any sense that mattered. I poured another cup of coffee, my third that morning, and finally picked up the envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal and removed the contents. A formal letter, legal in tone, stating that Harrison James Wells had officially removed me, Alexandra Nicole Wells, from his will and all associated financial provisions. The document required my signature as acknowledgement, nothing more. 5 years ago, I'd stood in my father's immaculate living room, surrounded by the carefully selected furnishings that had replaced the comfortable worn furniture from my childhood after my mother died. Photos of me had been systematically removed, replaced by artfully arranged images of his new wife, Caroline, and her daughter, Melody. "I've supported you through 3 abandoned degree programs, Alex," he'd said, voice clinical as if addressing an underperforming employee. "Engineering, dropped after 2 years. Business administration, abandoned after 18 months. And now this graphic design program you can't seem to commit to either. Dad, I'm just trying to find..." "What? Find what? Yourself?" His laugh had been sharp, unfamiliar. "Life isn't about finding yourself. It's about building something worthwhile. Your mother would be so disappointed in what you've become." The invocation of my mother, gone 8 years by then, had been the cruelest blow. Catherine Wells had been a nurturing force who'd always assured me that discovering my path might take time. "Some people are born knowing exactly what they want," she'd tell me. "Others need to explore a little longer. Neither journey is wrong, just different." But after her death from breast cancer when I was 20, my father's patience with my exploration had steadily eroded, particularly after he'd married Caroline 2 years later. Caroline, with her corporate efficiency, and her daughter Melody, who'd known she wanted to be a doctor since age 12, a living reminder of the daughter I had failed to become. "I'm starting my own business," I'd told him that fateful day, a last desperate attempt to earn his approval. "A creative consultancy. I've been freelancing, building a client base. I just need a small loan to secure office space, and I can..." Enough. The word had sliced through the air between us. "I'm done investing in your failures. You're 23, years old, living in that dilapidated apartment, jumping from one half-baked scheme to another. You're a disappointment and a failure. I no longer consider you my daughter." I'd stood there, tears streaming down my face as he'd continued in his attorney's voice, explaining that he was removing me from his will, that any further financial support would cease immediately, that I should finally grow up and face reality. When I'd left his house that day, I'd known with absolute certainty it would be the last time I crossed that threshold. Now, 5 years later, the legal document in my hands merely formalized what had already been made abundantly clear. I should have felt nothing. The wound was old, scarred over. Yet seeing it in black and white reopened everything. I signed where indicated, slipped the paper back into its envelope, and set it aside to mail later. My phone rang, the screen lighting up with a client's name, Jasmine from Horizon Startups, probably calling about the branding package I'd delivered yesterday. I composed myself and answered with my professional voice. Alexandra Wells Design. This is Alex. Alex, these designs are exceptional, Jasmine gushed. The team is blown away. This perfectly captures our vision while adding elements we hadn't even considered. The board wants to know if you'd consider coming on as our permanent creative director. I blinked, momentarily disoriented by the contrast between the rejection in the envelope and the enthusiastic approval in Jasmine's voice. I'm flattered, Jasmine. Can you send over the details? I'd like to think about it. After ending the call, I glanced around my home office, no longer a corner of a dilapidated apartment, but the converted second bedroom of my downtown condo. My half-baked scheme had evolved into Alexandra Wells Design, a boutique creative consultancy that had, against all odds and my father's predictions, become not just sustainable but successful. The journey hadn't been easy. After my father's rejection, I'd worked 70-hour weeks, taking any design job I could find while simultaneously building my business plan. I'd lived on ramen and determination, weathered client rejections, endured countless revisions, and gradually, painstakingly built a reputation for innovative design solutions that delivered results. Last year, I'd been featured in Entrepreneur Magazine's 30 Under 30 list. I'd sent a copy to my father's office, not out of spite, but as a quiet statement. You were wrong about me. The magazine had been returned unopened. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the peephole, I saw a courier holding an envelope. Delivery for Alexandra Wells, she announced, handing me a thin package requiring signature. Priority delivery. Alone again, I opened this new envelope, finding a single sheet of expensive stationery. The handwriting was unfamiliar, feminine, and hurried. Alexandra, I know we've never met properly, though I feel I know you through your father's stories. I'm writing because Harrison has suffered a heart attack. He's stable, but requires bypass surgery. During his hospitalization, my daughter Melody was involved in a serious car accident. She needs emergency neurosurgery our insurance won't fully cover. The procedure costs $175,000. Your father would never ask, but I'm setting aside pride. If you could find it in your heart to help, we would ensure repayment. Harrison doesn't know I'm contacting you. With hope, Caroline Wells, P.S. We're at Mercy General Hospital if you wish to respond in person. I read the letter twice, emotions colliding like storm fronts. My father was ill. The stepdaughter who had replaced me needed expensive surgery, and somehow, the universe had arranged for the daughter deemed worthless to be the only one who could help. The irony wasn't lost on me. 5 years of silence broken not by an apology, but by a financial request. 5 years during which I'd rebuilt myself from the ground up, transforming rejection into determination, creating exactly the kind of success my father might have respected, if he'd bothered to notice. I checked my watch, 3:17 p.m. I had a prospective client meeting at 4 that could potentially bring in my largest contract to date. Mercy General was across town, at least 30 minutes in traffic. I picked up my phone, prepared to call Caroline and explain I couldn't come today, perhaps offer to discuss financial arrangements tomorrow. Then I stopped, a memory surfacing, unbidden. My father at my hospital bedside when I was 12, having broken my arm falling from a tree. Despite an important court case the next morning, he'd stayed all night, helping me manage the pain, telling stories to distract me until dawn painted the hospital room gold. Before his heart hardened, before disappointment replaced love. I set the phone down and grabbed my car keys instead. The client would have to wait. Whether motivated by compassion, curiosity, or the lingering hope for reconciliation I'd never fully extinguished, I needed to see my father face to face. As I drove toward Mercy General, a strange calm settled over me. For 5 years, I'd defined myself in opposition to my father's dismissal, building a life that proved his assessment wrong. Now I was driving toward the man who had shattered my world with a single sentence. I no longer consider you my daughter. Armed. Not with recriminations, but with exactly the success he'd never believed I could achieve. The irony was almost perfect. Almost. Mercy General Hospital loomed before me, a sprawling complex of glass and steel that seemed to absorb the afternoon sunlight rather than reflect it. I sat in my parked car, hands still gripping the steering wheel, gathering courage for what lay ahead. The last time I'd seen my father, his face had been contorted with disappointment. Now he was somewhere in this building, his heart literally broken, unaware that his discarded daughter was about to walk back into his life. I smoothed my charcoal pencil skirt, the one I wore for important client presentations, and checked my appearance in the rearview mirror. I looked polished, professional, successful. Good. Whether this reunion ended in reconciliation or further rejection, I would face it as the woman I had become, not the struggling 20-something he had dismissed. The hospital's main entrance opened into a bustling atrium. At the information desk, a volunteer with silver hair and kind eyes directed me to the cardiac unit on the 4th floor. "Wells, Harrison," she confirmed, checking her computer. "Room 417. The elevator ride felt interminable. I rehearsed potential opening lines in my head, each sounding either too casual or too formal for the weight of the moment. How does one address a father who has legally disowned them? "Hello, Dad," seemed inappropriately intimate. "Mr. Wells" felt coldly defensive. Perhaps no words at all would be best. Just my presence, letting him make the first move. The cardiac unit was quieter than the main floor, the sounds muffled to a clinical hush. I followed the numbered signs until I reached 417, the door partially closed. Through the gap, I could see a woman sitting beside the bed, her back to the door. Caroline, my father's wife of 7 years whom I'd met exactly twice, both occasions strained with awkward politeness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I knocked softly. Caroline turned, her eyes widening in recognition and something like relief. She rose quickly, smoothing her wrinkled blouse as she approached. "Alexandra," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." Up close, Caroline looked far older than I remembered. Her carefully highlighted blonde hair was now streaked with gray at the temples, and fine lines mapped her face like tributaries. The past 5 years had evidently not been kind. "I got your note," I replied simply. "How is he?" Caroline glanced, back toward the bed where my father lay sleeping, monitoring equipment creating a technological cocoon around him. "Stable. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The doctor is confident, but—" She trailed off, the unspoken fears hanging between us. I stepped fully into the room, seeing my father clearly for the first time. Harrison Wells had always been a commanding presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of authoritative posture that dominated courtrooms and boardrooms alike. The man in the hospital bed seemed diminished, his skin ashen against the white. Sheets, oxygen cannula tucked beneath his nose. His dark hair, once merely peppered with gray, was now almost completely silver. "He doesn't know I contacted you," Caroline said, her voice drawing me back from my observations. "He's been stubborn about reaching out." "That sounds like him," I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Caroline winced slightly. "Alexandra." "Alex," I corrected automatically. "I go by Alex now." "Alex," she amended. "I know things between you and your father have been complicated." but he's spoken of you often over the years. The revelation surprised me. Has he? She nodded. Usually late at night when he thinks I'm asleep. He keeps track of your business. He has a folder with articles about you, including that magazine feature last year. I absorbed this information with confusion. If he'd been following my career, why the continued silence? Why return the magazine unopened? Why formalize my disinheritance just days ago? Before I could pursue these questions, a nurse entered to check my father's vitals, forcing our conversation to pause. Caroline used the interruption to guide me back to the hallway. Melody is in the neurology wing, she explained once we were outside. 6th floor. The accident happened 2 days ago. A truck ran a red light and hit her car on the driver's side. She has an intracranial hematoma requiring immediate surgery. And insurance won't cover it? I asked, professional instincts kicking in. Something about the story wasn't adding up. My father had always maintained excellent insurance. Caroline's eyes dropped, her fingers nervously twisting the wedding band on her left hand. Our policy has a lifetime maximum benefit that Melody already exceeded 3 years ago. She had previous medical issues, extended psychiatric care. This was new information. The perfectly poised stepdaughter, the one whose predetermined life path had been favorably compared to my wandering, had apparently faced her own struggles. I see, I said neutrally. And my father's assets? Caroline's expression tightened. The firm has been struggling since the economic downturn. Harrison took out a second mortgage on the house to keep things afloat. His retirement account was used to cover Melody's previous medical expenses. She stopped, seeming to search for the right words. We're not in the position we once were. The implicit admission hung between us. My father, who had criticized my financial choices, who had cut me off for my supposed irresponsibility, had apparently mismanaged his own affairs to the point of precarity. I need to think about this, I said finally. And I'd like to see Melody. Caroline nodded, relief visible in her shoulders. Of course, I'll take you to her room. We rode the elevator in silence, each floor's ascending number giving me time to process what I'd learned. By the time we reached the neurology wing, I had formulated at least a dozen questions about my father's financial situation, about the timing of the disinheritance papers, about why Caroline had reached out now, after years of silence. Melody's room was darker than my father's, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. She lay motionless, her head partially shaved and bandaged, face bruised and swollen almost beyond recognition. Monitoring equipment beeped steadily, mapping her continued existence in electronic pulses. The doctor says the longer we wait, the higher the risk of permanent damage, Caroline said softly. The neurosurgeon who specializes in this procedure has an opening tomorrow afternoon, but they require payment confirmation by 9 a.m. I studied Melody's damaged face, searching for the confident teenager who had sat silently beside my father. During our final confrontation, her presence a living rebuke to my perceived failures. But I could see only a vulnerable young woman, unconscious and in danger. I'll need to speak with the doctors directly, I said, my business voice taking over. And I want to review the exact costs involved. Caroline nodded quickly. Of course. I can arrange that right away. As she stepped out to summon a doctor, I moved closer to Melody's bedside. Despite everything, the comparisons, the silent judgment, the way she had seamlessly replaced me in family photographs, I felt no satisfaction seeing her like this. Whatever resentment I'd harbored toward her was irrelevant in the face of her suffering. The neurosurgeon arrived promptly, a tall woman with prematurely gray hair and direct, intelligent eyes. Dr. Patel walked me through Melody's condition, the proposed procedure, and the expected outcomes with clinical precision. The $175,000 price tag covered not just the surgery, but the specialized team required, and the intensive post-operative care. Without insurance, this is our standard rate, she explained, not unkindly. The hospital requires confirmation of payment before scheduling. I understand, I replied, my mind already calculating. The amount represented nearly 2/3 of my business's emergency fund, money I'd painstakingly set aside over 5 years of careful growth. Using it would mean delaying my planned office expansion, possibly turning down the creative director position at Horizon, and remaining in consultant mode for at least another year. I'll need until tomorrow morning to arrange the funds, I told Dr. Patel, making my decision. Will that be sufficient? As long as we have confirmation by 9 a.m., we can proceed as scheduled, she confirmed. After the doctor left, Caroline returned, hope and anxiety warring in her expression. What did she say? The surgery is necessary, I replied simply. I'll handle the payment. The relief that washed over Caroline's face was almost painful to witness. She reached for my hands, gripping them tightly. Thank you, Alex. Your father would never ask, but I'm not doing it for him, I interrupted, gently extracting my hands from hers. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. But I have questions that need answers. Caroline's relief faltered. Of course. Anything. Not now, I said, gathering my purse. Tomorrow, after I've confirmed the payment and checked on my father. I need to return to my office and make arrangements. As I turned to leave, Caroline called after me. Alex? He does regret it, you know. The things he said to you. He's just too proud to admit it. I paused at the door, neither accepting nor rejecting her statement. Pride had always been my father's defining characteristic, his strength in the courtroom and his fatal flaw as a parent. Tomorrow, I repeated, and left without looking back. The drive to my office was a blur, my mind racing with implications and decisions. By the time I reached the familiar glass building housing Alexandra Wells' design, the sun was setting, painting the windows in shades of amber and gold. My assistant, Ryan, looked up in surprise as I entered. I rescheduled the Horizon meeting for tomorrow at 11, he reported. Jasmine was very understanding. Cancel it entirely, I instructed, striding toward my office. And get me Martin from First National on the phone. I need to arrange a significant wire transfer for tomorrow morning. Ryan's eyebrows rose, but he asked no questions, immediately reaching for the phone. That professionalism was why I'd hired him, why my business had grown to support 3 full-time employees and a network of contractors. Inside my office, I stared at the view of the city skyline, lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. 5 years ago, I'd sat in a shabby apartment, crying over my father's rejection, wondering how I would survive without his support. Now I stood in an office I had built, preparing to pay a medical bill that would save my stepsister's life. A sum larger than anything my father had ever given me. The journey from that desperate young woman to the business owner I'd become had been arduous, marked by countless late nights, rejected proposals, and moments of crippling self-doubt. But each setback had forced me to become more resilient, more creative, more determined to prove, if only to myself, that I was not the failure my father had declared me to be. Tomorrow I would face him again, this time from a position of strength. Not to gloat or seek revenge, but to understand why the man who had once been my hero had given up on me so completely. And perhaps, though I hardly dared admit it even to myself, to see if there was anything left between us worth salvaging. Ryan knocked softly, interrupting my thoughts. Martin's on line 1. And Alex? Whatever's happening. You've got this. I smiled gratefully at his vote of confidence and picked up the phone, ready to take the first step toward a confrontation 5 years in the making. The morning sun streamed through my bedroom windows, finding me already awake, sitting at the small writing desk where I'd spent half the night. Sleep had been elusive, my mind churning with questions and calculations. The notepad before me contained rows of figures, projections of how my business would manage with a significantly depleted emergency fund, timelines for rebuilding our financial cushion, and potential sacrifices we might need to make in the coming months. By 6 a.m., I had made my decision. By 7 a.m., I was showered and dressed in a tailored navy suit that projected the confidence I needed to feel. By 8 a.m., I was at First National Bank, finalizing the wire transfer with Martin, the business accounts manager who had helped me open my first professional checking account 5 years earlier. "This is a substantial withdrawal, Alex," Martin noted, peering at me over his reading glasses. "You're sure about this?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "The funds need to reach Mercy General by 9 a.m. Martin nodded, processing the transaction with efficient keystrokes. "You've built something impressive here," he remarked as he worked. "When you opened your account with that initial deposit of $200, I wouldn't have predicted this level of growth in just 5 years." A small smile touched my lips. Neither would my father. The transaction complete, I drove directly to the hospital, arriving at 8:45 a.m. The administrative office was ready for me, paperwork prepared. I signed where indicated, provided the transfer confirmation details, and officially committed $175,000 to save the life of a stepsister who had been part of the family that replaced me. "The hospital appreciates your prompt handling of this matter," the financial administrator said, her tone professional but warm. "Dr. Patel's office will be notified immediately that the surgery can proceed as scheduled." With the payment confirmed, I made my way to the cardiac unit. Whether by coincidence or design, my father's bypass surgery was scheduled for the same day as Melody's procedure. According to the nurse I spoke with, he was being prepped right now, meaning I had perhaps 20 minutes before they would take him to the operating room. I paused outside room 417, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Through the partially open door, I could hear Caroline's voice, soft and concerned. "The surgeon says it's routine, Harrison. You'll be fine." "Melody?" My father's voice, weaker than I remembered but still carrying that distinctive timbre, that had once narrated bedtime stories and later delivered crushing judgment. "Still scheduled for this afternoon," Caroline replied. "Try not to worry." "How are we paying for it?" His question contained the pragmatic worry that had always characterized him. Even on the edge of surgery, his mind went to practical matters. There was a pause before Caroline answered. "It's been taken care of." "What does that mean, taken care of?" The sharpness in his tone was familiar, the attorney demanding clarity. I chose that moment to enter, my heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. Both heads turned toward me, Caroline's expression a mixture of relief and apprehension, my father's showing pure shock. "It means I've paid for it," I said, my voice steady despite the thundering of my heart. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic beeping of my father's heart monitor. He stared at me as if seeing a ghost, his complexion somehow becoming even paler. "Alexandra?" he finally managed, the name sounding strange in his mouth after so many years of silence. "Hello, Father," I replied, deliberately formal. "I understand you're having surgery this morning." Caroline stood quickly. "I'll give you two some privacy," she murmured, slipping past me with a grateful squeeze of my arm. Alone with my father, for the first time in 5 years, I moved closer to his bedside, taking in the changes time had wrought. Beyond the silver hair and new lines etched into his face, there was a vulnerability I'd never associated with Harrison Wells. He'd always seemed invincible to me, even after my mother's death had proved that our family wasn't immune to tragedy. "You paid for Melody's surgery?" he asked, cutting straight to the point as always. "Yes, $175,000. The transfer was confirmed this morning." He closed his eyes briefly, as if processing this information required more strength than he currently possessed. When he opened them again, they held a question he seemed unable to voice. "I can afford it," I answered anyway. My half-baked scheme turned out to be quite profitable. A shadow of recognition crossed his face at the echo of his own dismissive words. Your design business. Alexandra Wells Design, I confirmed. We specialize in brand strategy and visual communications for tech startups and financial institutions. 27 employees now, offices in 3 cities. Our projected revenue this year is $2 million. I hadn't intended to list these achievements like credentials, but they spilled out anyway. The measuring stick I'd been using to prove my worth since the day he'd deemed me worthless. He absorbed this information in silence, his lawyer's mind, no doubt calculating exactly how far I'd come without his support. Finally, he asked, "Why would you help us, after everything?" The question hung between us, heavy with the weight of unspoken history. Why indeed? I moved to the window, gathering my thoughts as I looked out at the hospital parking lot below. I've been asking myself the same question since Caroline's note arrived, I admitted. I'm still not entirely sure of the answer. I turned back, to face him. It's not because I've forgotten what you said to me. It's not because I'm seeking reconciliation or hoping to change your opinion of me. I stopped measuring my worth by your assessment years ago. Then why? He pressed, a hint of the old intensity returning to his voice. Because Mom would have wanted me to, I said simply. And because refusing to help someone in need just to prove a point would make me exactly the kind of person you accused me of being 5 years ago. Selfish and irresponsible. My father flinched as if I'd struck him. For a moment, I thought, he might argue or defend his past actions. Instead, he nodded once, accepting the implicit criticism. I received your legal paperwork, I continued, changing the subject. Finalizing my removal from your will, the timing seems interesting. He frowned. What paperwork? The documents from Blackwell and Associates. I signed them yesterday. My father's confusion appeared genuine. I haven't used Blackwell in over 2 years. Not since the firm downsized and I started my own practice. Now it was my turn to be confused. But I received official documentation. A nurse appeared in the doorway, interrupting our conversation. Mr. Wells, it's time to prep you for surgery. She looked at me apologetically. I'm sorry, but you'll need to step out now. Wait, my father said, reaching for my hand with surprising urgency. His fingers felt cold against my skin. Alexandra. Alex. Will you be here? After? The question contained a vulnerability I'd never heard from him before. For a moment, I saw past the stern attorney who had judged me so harshly to the man beneath. Aging, ill, and perhaps, in his way, afraid. I'll check on you this evening, I promised, neither committing to a lengthy vigil nor refusing outright. I have meetings this afternoon. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with this compromise. As the nurse prepared to wheel him away, he tightened his grip on my hand momentarily. The firm isn't what it was, he said, his voice low and urgent. Be careful with Caroline. Things aren't as they seem. Before I could ask what he meant, the nurse was guiding his bed toward the door, and the moment for questions had passed. I remained in the empty room after they left, trying to make sense of our brief exchange. The warning about Caroline seemed at odds with her apparent relief at my arrival and gratitude for my financial assistance. And what had he meant about the paperwork? If he hadn't sent the disinheritance documents, who had? My phone chimed with a calendar alert, a reminder of the conference call I'd scheduled with my team to explain the financial adjustments we'd need to make. I couldn't linger in the hospital pondering mysteries when my business required attention. As I gathered my things to leave, Caroline returned, looking simultaneously exhausted and animated. They've taken him for surgery? She asked, glancing at the empty bed. Yes, just now, I confirmed. He seemed concerned about you. Caroline smiled faintly. Harrison always worries too much. She moved closer, lowering her voice. I can't thank you enough for what you've done, Alex. When Melody recovers, we'll work out a repayment plan. Harrison doesn't know how generous you've been, but I've told him we secured a medical loan. Why lie to him? I asked, genuinely curious. She sighed, sinking into a chair. Your father has his pride. Learning that his discarded daughter rescued his new family would be difficult for him to accept, especially given his recent financial struggles. About those struggles, I began, choosing my words carefully. He mentioned something about the firm downsizing. What exactly happened? Caroline's expression clouded. The pandemic hit legal services hard. Then Harrison's former partner made some questionable investments with the firm's reserves. It's been a difficult few years. She hesitated, then added, That's why the disinheritance papers were finally filed. There was nothing left to leave you anyway, so Harrison thought it best to make it official. This contradicted my father's apparent confusion about the documents, but before I could press further, my phone rang. Ryan, likely calling about our scheduled conference call. I need to take this, I said, moving toward the door. Business matters. Caroline nodded, understanding. Of course. Will you be back later? For Harrison? After my meetings, I confirmed. And I'd like to check on Melody as well. Her surgery is scheduled for 2 p.m., Caroline informed me. I'll be with, her until then if you need anything. As I left the hospital, my mind was buzzing with contradictions and questions. My father's warning about Caroline contrasted sharply with her seemingly transparent gratitude. His confusion about the legal paperwork didn't align with her explanation. Something wasn't adding up, and my business instincts, the same ones that had helped me identify promising clients and avoid problematic partnerships, were signaling caution. Sitting in my car, I made a decision. Before returning to the hospital that evening, I needed to verify some facts. If I was going to navigate whatever complex situation existed between my father and his new family, I needed more information than either of them had provided. I started the engine, pulling out my phone to make a call to an old college friend who now worked at the county records office. The $175,000 was already spent. I couldn't undo that decision. But I could ensure that whatever came next would be based on truth rather than manipulation. As I drove toward my office, the morning sun glinted off the buildings downtown, illuminating the skyline that had become the backdrop to my hard-won success. 5 years ago, I'd allowed my father's judgment to devastate me. Today, I was making choices based on my own values while maintaining the clear-eyed assessment that had built my business. If reconciliation with my father was possible, it would need to be founded on honesty. And if Caroline's intentions weren't as straightforward as they appeared, I would need to be prepared for that reality as well. Either way, I was no longer the broken young woman desperately seeking approval. Whatever revelations awaited, I would face them as Alexandra Wells, CEO, a woman who had learned the hard way that true worth comes from within, not from another's assessment. The midday sun blazed overhead as I pulled into the parking lot of the county records office, a nondescript government building that housed the paper trail of countless lives and transactions. My college roommate, Diane Reeves, waited by the entrance, her county employee badge visible against her practical navy blazer. We'd stayed in touch over the years, occasionally meeting for coffee to trade stories of career triumphs and dating disasters. Now I was calling in a favor that stretched the boundaries of our friendship. Alexandra Wells, she greeted me with a quick hug. 5 years of dodging my dinner invitations, but you call when you need property records? I smiled apologetically. I know, and I promise a proper catch-up soon. This is complicated. Family drama usually is, Diane replied, swiping her badge at the employee entrance. You didn't give me much to go on over the phone. As we walked through the fluorescent-lit corridors, I outlined what I needed. Property records for my father's house, information about any second mortgage, and details about his law practice's current status. That's a lot of sensitive information, Diane noted, leading me to a small research room equipped with a computer terminal. Some of it isn't public record. I know, I acknowledged. I wouldn't ask if it weren't important. Diane studied my face for a moment, then nodded. Give me 20 minutes. I'll see what I can access. While waiting, I called Ryan for an update on our morning conference call with the team. The news was cautiously positive. Our designers and account managers had responded to the financial adjustment with professional understanding. We would postpone the office expansion, scale back our year-end bonus projections, and focus on high-value clients for the next 6 months while rebuilding our reserves. The Horizon Creative Director offer is still on the table, Ryan reminded me. That alone would stabilize our cash flow if you decide to take it. It would also fundamentally change how we operate, I replied. I built this company to maintain creative independence. True, but circumstances change, he pointed out pragmatically. Just something to consider. Diane returned carrying a manila folder, ironically similar to the one that had contained my supposed disinheritance papers. Her expression was difficult to read. I found some interesting things, she said, closing the door for privacy. Your father's house does have a second mortgage, taken out 3 years ago. But here's where it gets curious. The funds weren't used to support his law practice. How do you know? I asked. She opened the folder, revealing printouts of various documents. Because his practice was dissolved 4 years ago. He surrendered his license to practice law following a disciplinary hearing. The information hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. He's been practicing for 30 years. It was his life. Not for the past 4 years, Diane said gently, showing me the official record. According to this, Harrison James Wells voluntarily surrendered his license following allegations of mishandling client funds. I stared at the document, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. My father, whose integrity had been the cornerstone of his identity, who had lectured me endlessly about responsibility and ethical behavior, had apparently violated the fundamental principles of his profession. There's more, Diane continued. The second mortgage wasn't applied to any business. The funds, nearly $400,000, were withdrawn in cash over a period of 6 months. Cash? I echoed, struggling to make sense of this information. That's unusual, Diane supplied, especially given that the property is now facing foreclosure proceedings. First payment was missed 8 months ago. The pieces were slowly assembling into a picture I couldn't quite comprehend. My father had lost his law license. The family home was in foreclosure. Nearly $500,000 had disappeared. And through it all, Caroline had maintained the fiction of a struggling but operational law practice. What about Blackwell and Associates? I asked. Are they still active? Diane pulled up another document on the computer. Yes, they're a legitimate firm, but they haven't represented your father in any capacity for years. Which meant the disinheritance papers couldn't have come from them. They were forgeries. One more thing, Diane said, lowering her voice although we were alone in the room. I checked medical records. We have limited access for insurance verification purposes. There's no record of a Melody Wells being admitted to Mercy General for a car accident or scheduled for neurosurgery. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. That's not possible. I saw her yesterday. She was unconscious, injured. I'm not saying she's not there, Diane clarified. Just that there's no official record under that name. Could be entered under a different name for privacy, or there might be a processing delay. Or it could be another lie in what was becoming an increasingly elaborate deception. I gathered the documents, my mind racing to connect the disparate threads of information. I need copies of everything you've found. Already made them for you, Diane replied, handing me a sealed envelope. Just be careful, Alex. Whatever's happening here doesn't feel right. I thanked her, promising the dinner I'd been postponing for years, and headed back to my car. Once inside, I called Ryan again. "I need you to do something discreetly," I instructed. "Contact Mercy General's billing department as if you're verifying an insurance claim. Ask about the status of Melody Wells's neurosurgery, scheduled for 2 p.m. today." "That's technically fraud," Ryan pointed out. "Just ask if the procedure has been confirmed and paid for," I clarified. "Nothing more. I need to verify something." While waiting for Ryan's callback, I reviewed the documents Diane had provided. The disciplinary action against my father detailed a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior following financial irregularities. Client funds had been temporarily misappropriated, then replaced, suggesting desperation rather than calculated theft. The voluntary surrender of his license had avoided criminal charges. What could have driven my father, meticulous, principled Harrison Wells, to such behavior? My phone rang. Ryan's voice was tense when I answered. "I spoke with billing at Mercy General," he reported. "There's no neurosurgery scheduled for a Melody Wells today. However, they did confirm receipt of our payment this morning, applied to an account under the name Melody Tanner. The procedure is an elective cosmetic surgery, not emergency neurosurgery." The final piece clicked into place, completing a picture of breathtaking deception. There was no emergency, no traumatic car accident. The supposedly life-saving procedure I'd paid for was elective, likely the kind of cosmetic enhancement my father had always dismissed as vanity. "What do you want me to do?" Ryan asked after I'd been silent for several moments. "We could contact the hospital administration, maybe the police." "No," I said firmly. "Not yet. First, I need to understand exactly what's happening. Keep this information confidential for now." I checked the time, 1:17 p.m. If the cosmetic procedure was scheduled for 2 p.m., Caroline would be with Melody now, preparing her for surgery. And my father would be in post-operative recovery from his cardiac bypass. I started the car, my decision made. I would confront Caroline directly, with evidence in hand. Whatever scheme she had orchestrated, whether my father was complicit or victim, ended today. The drive back to Mercy General gave me time to organize my thoughts and strategy. The businesswoman in me, the one who had built a successful company from nothing, approached the situation analytically. I had been manipulated. Yes, but I hadn't lost everything. The $175,000 was a significant setback but not a catastrophic one. My company would recover. My professional reputation remained intact. What stung more deeply was the realization that I had allowed myself to be emotionally manipulated. After years of building walls against my father's judgment, I had left myself vulnerable to Caroline's exploitation of my lingering hope for reconciliation. I parked in the hospital lot, gathered the envelope of documents, and made my way directly to the cosmetic surgery wing. Not the neurology department where I'd seen unconscious Melody the day before. At the nurse's station, I asked for Melody Tanner's room. "Are you family?" the nurse inquired. "Stepsister," I replied without hesitation. "I'm the one who paid for the procedure." This was apparently the magic phrase, as the nurse immediately directed me to room 631. Outside the door, I paused, hearing Caroline's voice within. "The swelling will be significant at first, but Dr. Levine says you'll see the final results in about 3 months. Just think, you'll have the perfect profile for your audition season." "And Harrison doesn't suspect anything?" Melody's voice, alert, coherent, not at all like someone who had been unconscious from a traumatic brain injury the day before. "He thinks you're having emergency surgery for a car accident," Caroline confirmed with a laugh. "And he thinks we got a medical loan. If he knew his daughter paid for your nose job, he'd—" I pushed the door open without knocking. Caroline spun around, her face draining of color as she registered my presence. Melody, sitting upright in bed, perfectly conscious, with only some pre-surgical markings on her face, looked more annoyed than alarmed. "He'd what, Caroline?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Have another heart attack? Or just be ashamed of the elaborate fraud you've perpetrated? Caroline recovered quickly, a practiced smile replacing her initial shock. Alex, I was just explaining to Melody how generous you've been. There seems to have been some miscommunication about— Stop. I held up my hand, then placed the envelope of documents on the bedside table. No more lies. I know everything. I turned to Melody. There was no car accident, no emergency neurosurgery. You're having a rhinoplasty, an elective cosmetic procedure that you scheduled months ago, judging by the preparation involved. Melody at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. It's not just cosmetic, she muttered. I have a deviated septum that affects my vocal performance. A condition your insurance would likely cover, I noted coldly, without requiring $175,000 in cash. Caroline stepped forward, her demeanor shifting from friendly to calculating. Alex, let me explain. Yes, we misrepresented the nature of Melody's procedure, but your father really did have a heart attack. We really are in financial difficulty. The money will help us keep our home. The home that's been in foreclosure for 8 months? I interrupted. The one with a $400,000 second mortgage that was withdrawn in cash? Or perhaps you mean the law practice that hasn't existed since. My father surrendered his license 4 years ago. Caroline's facade crumbled entirely. She sank into a chair, her expression hardening into something ugly and unfamiliar. You've been investigating us, she accused. I've been uncovering the truth, I corrected, something you clearly never expected me to do. I turned back to Melody, who was watching our exchange with wide eyes. Did you know your medical records are under your original surname? That's an interesting choice for someone who's been a Wells for 7 years. Melody glanced at her mother, uncertainty replacing her earlier entitlement. Your mother created a convincing fiction, I continued, the struggling but respectable attorney maintaining his practice despite economic hardship. The dutiful wife supporting him through difficult times, the talented daughter needing emergency medical care. I faced Caroline directly. But it's all a lie, isn't it? No law practice, no car accident. And the disinheritance papers? Forgeries designed to make me believe my father had finally and formally rejected me, making your subsequent appeal to my better nature more likely to succeed. You don't understand, Caroline began. Oh, I understand perfectly, I replied. What I don't know is whether my father is your accomplice or your victim. Did he agree to this scheme, or have you been manipulating him as skillfully as you attempted? To manipulate me? The answer came from behind me, in a voice weakened by surgery but unmistakable in its authority. She's been lying to us both, Alexandra. I turned to find my father in a wheelchair at the door, a nurse standing uncertainly behind him. His hospital gown and pale complexion couldn't diminish the intensity of his expression. A combination of anger, shame, and something that might have been pride as he looked at me. Mr. Wells, the nurse protested, you shouldn't be out of bed. Your surgery just finished. And yet here I am, my father replied grimly. Leave us, please. This is a family matter. As the nurse reluctantly departed, closing the door behind her, Caroline rose to her feet, a new calculation visible in her eyes. Harrison, you need to rest. You're confused from the anesthesia. Enough. My father's voice cracked like a gavel, silencing her instantly. I heard everything, and Alexandra deserves the truth. He looked at me, his eyes clear despite his physical weakness. I never sent those disinheritance papers. I never stopped considering you my daughter. And while I lost my practice through my own failings, the rest of Caroline's story appears to be as much a fabrication to me as it was to you. For the first time in 5 years, I found myself believing my father completely. Whatever reconciliation might be possible between us remained to be seen, but in this moment, we were unexpectedly aligned against a common deception. Caroline looked from one of us to the other, her plans visibly unraveling. But rather than surrender, she straightened her shoulders, a calculating smile replacing her momentary defeat. "Well," she said coolly, "this is an interesting development. But the surgery is still paid for. Harrison is still recovering from a very real heart condition, and the money has already been transferred. So perhaps we should all take some time to consider our next steps carefully." The implied threat was clear. Make an issue of this, and there could be consequences for everyone. But Caroline had underestimated what 5 years of building a business from nothing had taught me. I had faced down difficult clients, navigated cash flow crises, and overcome countless professional obstacles. Her manipulations were amateur by comparison. "You're right about one thing," I replied calmly. "We should all consider our next steps carefully, starting with how financial fraud and false medical claims might interest both the hospital administration and the authorities." I turned to my father, seeing him, really seeing him, for the first time in years, not as the infallible judge of my worth, nor as the cruel rejecter of my dreams, but as a flawed man who had made his own serious mistakes. "We have a lot to discuss," I told him. "But first, you need to return to recovery, and I need to speak with the hospital billing department about a payment made under false pretenses." As I helped the nurse return my father to his room, leaving Caroline and Melody to contemplate the unraveling of their scheme, I felt an unexpected lightness. The $175,000 might be lost, but something far more valuable had been found. The beginning of a truth that, however painful, offered the possibility of genuine healing. And in that moment, I understood that my true inheritance had never been financial. It was the resilience I had built, the business I had created, and the wisdom to recognize that even the deepest wounds could become sources of strength when faced with honesty and courage. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with afternoon activity as I sat alone at a corner table, a cooling cup of coffee between my hands. 2 hours had passed since my confrontation with Caroline. In that time, I'd spoken with hospital administration about the fraudulent surgery claims, met with their legal department to explain the situation, and initiated the process to recover at least part of my payment. The hospital had been surprisingly understanding once I'd explained the circumstances, though their legal counsel warned that full reimbursement might require court proceedings. I rubbed my temples, fatigue settling into my bones. The emotional whiplash of the past 2 days, from reluctant daughter to financial savior to fraud victim, had left me drained. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "Team meeting went well. Taking care of everything. Focus on family matters." I smiled faintly at his perceptiveness. In just 2 years, Ryan had become more than an assistant. He'd become the reliable right hand that allowed my business to function even when my attention was divided. "Ms. Wells?" A nurse approached my table. "Your father is asking for you. He's been moved to a private room for recovery." I nodded, gathering my things. "How is he doing?" "Remarkably well for someone who had bypass surgery this morning and then decided to take a wheelchair excursion," she replied with professional disapproval. "The doctor says his heart function is improving already, but he needs rest and minimal stress." I almost laughed at the irony. Minimal stress seemed impossible given the circumstances, but I followed her to the elevators anyway. As we rode to the cardiac recovery floor, I mentally prepared for the conversation ahead. A conversation 5 years overdue. My father's new room was quieter than the post-operative recovery area, with large windows overlooking the hospital gardens. He was awake, propped up slightly, his complexion less gray than earlier. A book lay open on his lap, though his attention was focused on the doorway as I entered. "Alexandra," he greeted me, his voice stronger than before. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." "I said I would," I replied, taking the visitor's chair beside his bed. "Has Caroline been here?" His expression, Hardened. No. Hospital security is ensuring she doesn't enter this room without my explicit permission. One benefit of being the victim of attempted fraud: people take your concerns seriously. So, you've spoken with administration? He nodded. While you were talking to billing, a hospital administrator came to see me. Apparently, you made quite an impression. I shrugged, uncomfortable with his apparent approval. 5 years of emotional distance couldn't be bridged by one efficient handling of a crisis. The administrator mentioned you've initiated proceedings to recover the money, he continued. They're cooperating fully. It was a business decision, I said neutrally. Alexandra Wells' design can't afford to lose $175,000 to fraud, even familial fraud. Of course, he acknowledged. A silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken history. Finally, my father closed his book and looked at me directly. I owe you an explanation. About the license suspension, the financial problems, all of it. You don't owe me anything, I responded automatically. I do, he insisted. Not because you paid for a surgery under false pretenses, not because you came when Caroline called, but because I wronged you 5 years ago. And you deserve to understand why. The directness of his admission caught me off guard. My father had never been one to acknowledge mistakes easily. He continued without waiting for my response. After your mother died, I lost myself for a while. The grief was consuming, but I had you to focus on, a practice to maintain. Then you went to college, and the house was empty. The silence was unbearable. He shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. I met Carolyn at a fundraiser 3 years after Catherine's death. She was vibrant, sophisticated, everything the other grieving singles weren't. She laughed at my terrible jokes, seemed interested in my cases, made me feel alive again. I'd never heard this part of the story, how they'd met, what had drawn him to her. I'd been away at college during their courtship, returning only for the wedding that had felt like a betrayal of my mother's memory. Looking back, I see the calculation in every move she made, he admitted. But at the time, I saw only what I wanted to see. She moved in, redecorated, replaced Catherine's life with her own, so gradually I hardly noticed. And Melody? I asked. Melody was part of the package. Already 19, studying music performance at the conservatory. Talented, yes, but not the prodigy Caroline presented her as. Always needing just a little more money for special lessons, master classes, competitions. He sighed, pressing a hand gently against his chest, as if to contain the pain of these admissions. The first sign of trouble came 4 years ago. A client complained about delayed distribution of settlement funds. I discovered withdrawals from the client trust account, withdrawals I hadn't authorized. When I confronted Caroline, she broke down, confessed to a gambling addiction she'd hidden from me, begged for help. My eyes widened. This was unexpected. She stole from your clients? Using my passwords, my authority. I was legally responsible, regardless. I had a choice: report her to the authorities, face criminal charges myself for inadequate oversight, or quietly replace the funds and surrender my license. I chose the latter, believing I could salvage something of our life together if I protected her. The magnitude of this sacrifice, his career, his identity as an attorney, his reputation, was staggering. Why didn't you tell me? Pain flickered across his face. Pride, shame. By then, our relationship was already strained. You were struggling to find your path. I was struggling to accept that it wouldn't be the one I'd envisioned for you. Then Caroline suggested your design ambitions were childish fantasies, that you needed tough love to grow up. And you believed her, I said softly, the old hurt resurging. I believed the worst interpretation of your choices because it justified my own need for control, he admitted. When you came asking for a loan for your business, I saw only another potential failure, another disappointment. Caroline encouraged that view, and I said unforgivable things. I remembered that day with perfect clarity, standing in his living room, shaking with hurt and rage as he dismantled not just my business plan, but my worth as a person, as a daughter. After you left, he continued, things deteriorated rapidly. Without my practice, we relied on savings, then loans. Caroline's gambling problem mysteriously required more cash infusions. Melody's endless educational and performance needs drained accounts. I began to suspect I was being manipulated, but by then, I was trapped in a web of my own making. Why, didn't you reach out? I asked. Even after everything, I would have helped, he finished. Like you did yesterday? I know, that's what makes my failure so complete. I abandoned the one person who would have stood by me, all to protect someone who was systematically destroying everything I valued. The raw honesty in his voice pierced the armor I'd built around my heart. For 5 years, I'd carried the weight of his rejection, using it as fuel to prove him wrong. Now, seeing him diminished yet somehow more genuine than I'd ever known him to be, I felt the first stirrings of something I'd thought impossible: forgiveness. The heart attack was a blessing in disguise, my father said, gesturing to his surroundings. It forced a reckoning. When Caroline started talking about Melody's emergency surgery, something didn't add up. Melody had been perfectly fine the day before. Then I overheard Caroline on the phone discussing a cosmetic procedure that had been planned for months. I confronted her, we argued, and my chest started to tighten. That's when she contacted me, I realized. Not after your heart attack, but after you'd caught her in a lie. He nodded. I imagine she saw an opportunity, my medical crisis as cover for her scheme. She never expected you to investigate so thoroughly or confront her so directly. She underestimated you, just as I did 5 years ago. The admission hung between us, an acknowledgement of both his past failure and my current strength. What happens now? I asked. With Caroline? With the house? With everything? Divorce, certainly, he replied without hesitation. I've already contacted an attorney friend, not to practice, but to represent me personally. As for the house, it's likely lost to foreclosure. The money from the second mortgage is gone, gambled away, or hidden in accounts I'll never find. And Melody? Despite everything, I felt a twinge of sympathy for the young woman who had been raised by such a manipulative mother. She's Caroline's daughter in every sense, my father said wearily. Complicit in the deception, though perhaps not its architect. I've been father to her in name only. Any real relationship ended the moment I discovered their financial schemes. He fell silent, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. The day's events had clearly taken a toll on his already weakened condition. You need to rest, I said, rising from my chair. We can continue this conversation when you're stronger. Will you come back tomorrow? He asked, vulnerability naked in his voice. The question caught me off guard. Despite our conversation, despite his admissions, I hadn't yet decided whether reconciliation was something I wanted or could achieve. The wounds of his rejection ran deep, and trust, once broken, wasn't easily restored. I'll come, I promised after a moment's consideration. But I need to be clear about something. I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago. I've built a life, a business, an identity that exists completely apart from you. If we're going to have any relationship going forward, it needs to be based on who I am now, not who you wanted me to be then. He nodded slowly. I wouldn't want anything else. The woman who uncovered Caroline's scheme, who protected me when I didn't deserve protection, who built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing, that's someone I'd like to know. For the first time in our conversation, I smiled. A small, cautious expression, but genuine nonetheless. Then I'll see you tomorrow. As I left the hospital, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. a reminder that even the darkest days eventually yield to new light. I hadn't forgiven my father completely, nor had I forgotten the pain of his rejection. But I had begun to understand him as a flawed human being rather than the infallible judge I'd once perceived him to be. More importantly, I had confirmed what I'd suspected since building my business. I no longer needed his approval to validate my worth. The $175,000 I'd paid under false pretenses might never be fully recovered, but it had purchased something unexpectedly valuable: freedom from the last vestiges of seeking external validation. Walking to my car, I called Ryan. "Cancel my meetings tomorrow morning. I'll be in after lunch." "Family matters still unfolding?" he asked perceptively. "Yes," I confirmed, but in a way I never expected. As I drove home through the evening traffic, I reflected on the strange journey of the past 2 days. What had begun as a manipulative plea for financial assistance had somehow created the space for a truth 5 years in the making. My father wasn't the perfect man I'd once believed him to be, nor the heartless judge who had disowned me. He was simply human, capable of terrible mistakes, and perhaps genuine remorse. Whether our relationship could be rebuilt remained to be seen. But whatever happened, I would face it as the woman I had become, stronger for having been broken, wiser for having been fooled, and ultimately grateful for having been forced to discover my own worth when external validation was withdrawn. Some lessons, it seemed, could only be learned the hard way, and some inheritances were worth more than money. Morning light streamed through my apartment windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors I'd had installed last year. EI. Small luxury to celebrate Alexandra Wells Design's 3rd anniversary. I stood at my kitchen island, reviewing hospital billing documents spread before me while sipping the specialty coffee that had become my one consistent indulgence. The hospital's legal team had moved with surprising efficiency, freezing the surgical payment while investigations proceeded. They couldn't promise full recovery of funds, but the outlook was promising. My doorbell rang at precisely 8:30 a.m., Ryan arriving with the files I'd requested. I'd given him a key to my building months ago, but he maintained a respectful formality, never entering without explicit invitation. "Morning," he greeted me, handing over a sleek portfolio. Financial projections with 3 different recovery scenarios: full reimbursement, partial recovery at 60%, and worst case with no recovery. "Thank you," I replied, impressed as always by his thoroughness. "Coffee?" Ryan shook his head. "Already caffeinated, but I do have updates you'll want to hear." We moved to my living room, where Ryan pulled out his tablet and quickly summarized the day's business matters. The Horizon Creative Director offer had been extended another week, at my request. 2 new client proposals had received verbal approval. Our junior designer, Tessa, had completed the branding package for a healthcare startup ahead of schedule. "Also," Ryan added, his tone shifting slightly, "I received a call from a detective with financial crimes. They'd like to speak with you." "Regarding Caroline Wells." I raised an eyebrow. "Already? I only filed the fraud report yesterday afternoon." "Apparently, you're not the first person she's targeted," Ryan explained. The detective mentioned at least 2 other cases with similar patterns: marriages to professionals followed by financial manipulation. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, yet somehow it did. I'd assumed Caroline's scheme was opportunistic, developed in response to my father's financial vulnerability. The idea that it was her established modus operandi, that my father was just one in a series of targets, added another layer to the deception. "I'll call them this afternoon," I decided. "Anything else before you head to the office?" Ryan hesitated, then asked, "How are you handling all this? Personally, I mean." The question caught me off guard. Ryan and I maintained a friendly but professional relationship. Personal matters rarely entered our conversations. I searched for the right words. "Processing. It's a lot to absorb." Ryan nodded. "For what it's worth, The Alex Wells I've worked with for 2 years is the most resilient person I know. You built something extraordinary from nothing. Whatever happens with your father, that achievement stands. His words, simple but sincere, touched me unexpectedly. Thank you, Ryan. That means a lot. After he left, I reviewed the financial scenarios he'd prepared. Even in the worst case, with no recovery of the $175,000, Alexandra Wells' design would survive. Growth would slow, the office expansion would be delayed indefinitely, and bonuses would be minimal. But the core business would remain viable. We had weathered tighter financial situations in our early days. At 11 a.m., I left for the hospital, driving through mid-morning traffic with a strange mixture of apprehension and determination. Yesterday's conversation with my father had cracked, open a door I'd thought permanently sealed. Today would determine whether anything worth salvaging lay on the other side. When I arrived at his room, I found my father sitting up in a chair rather than the bed, dressed in his own pajamas rather than a hospital gown. Color had returned to his face, and though he still moved gingerly, his improvement was remarkable. The doctor says I'm exceeding expectations, he explained, noting my surprised expression. Apparently, righteous indignation is good for cardiac recovery. The flash of dry humor, so characteristic of the father I'd known before our estrangement, caught me off guard. I found myself smiling involuntarily as I took the visitor's chair. I brought something for you, I said, handing him a small package. The nurse said you could have non-hospital food if it wasn't too rich. He unwrapped the parcel to reveal dark chocolate from the artisan shop near my office, his favorite treat when I was growing up. His expression softened with recognition. You remembered, he said quietly. Some things stick with you, I replied neutrally, unwilling to be drawn too quickly into nostalgia. How are you feeling today? Physically? Better than expected. Emotionally? He sighed. I'm alternating between rage at Caroline's betrayal and disgust at my own gullibility. The hospital psychiatrist says both reactions are normal. You're seeing a psychiatrist? This was unexpected. My father had always dismissed therapy as paying strangers to tell you what you already know. Required after cardiac events. Apparently, he explained. But surprisingly helpful. We've had some illuminating conversations about patterns in my life, including how I treated you. He broke off a small piece of chocolate, considering it before continuing. Have you heard anything about your payment recovery? I updated him on the hospital's proceedings and the detective's interest in Caroline's case. He absorbed the information with a lawyer's analytical focus, asking pertinent questions about timing and procedure. You've handled this remarkably. Well, he observed, with more composure than many seasoned attorneys I've known. Running a business teaches crisis management quickly, I replied. You adapt or you fail. Like you adapted after our last conversation 5 years ago, he said, addressing directly what had remained implicit yesterday. I had no choice, I responded, the old hurt surfacing despite my best efforts. You made it very clear I was on my own. My father nodded slowly, accepting the deserved rebuke. I've had a lot of time to think about that day. The things I said to you were unforgivable. And yet here I am, I pointed out, not entirely sure why I had indeed returned after so much pain. Here you are, he agreed, which is more grace than I deserve, but entirely in character for the daughter Catherine and I raised. The mention of my mother shifted something in the atmosphere between us. Catherine Wells had been our common ground, our shared love. Her absence had created the initial fracture that had eventually become an unbridgeable chasm. I think Mom would be disappointed in how we've handled the past 5 years, I said quietly. She would have knocked our heads together long before. Now, my father replied, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. She always said we were too similar, both stubborn to a fault. She also said that was our strength, I remembered. That persistence was the foundation of achievement. She was right. My father set aside the chocolate, his expression turning serious. Your persistence built a successful business despite my predictions of failure. I was wrong, Alexandra. Completely, utterly wrong about you and your capabilities. The explicit acknowledgement, the words I'd once desperately longed to hear, landed differently than I might have expected years ago. Instead of vindication, I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that my achievements were finally recognized, sadness for the years of estrangement, and an unexpected sense of closure. I gave up waiting for your approval a long time ago, I told him honestly. I had to. Building my business required believing in myself when no one else did. Not no one, he corrected gently. Your mother would have believed in you implicitly, and it seems you found others who recognized what I failed to see. Your employees, your clients. I thought of Ryan's words earlier that morning, of Jasmine's enthusiasm for my designs, of the team that had rallied around me despite the financial setback. He was right. I had created not just a business, but a community that valued my vision and abilities. I did, I acknowledged. But your opinion mattered, more than anyone's. That's why your rejection hurt so deeply. My father winced at the word rejection, but didn't deny its accuracy. If I could undo that day, those words, I would. But since I can't, I can only ask if there's any possibility of moving forward. From here, not picking up where we left off. Too much has changed for that, but perhaps building something new. The question hung between us, weighty with implication. 5 years ago, I would have grasped desperately at any sign of reconciliation. Now, I had the emotional security to consider it carefully, to weigh what a relationship with my father might look like without the desperate need for validation that had characterized our past interactions. I don't know, I answered honestly. There's a lot of hurt to process, a lot of trust to rebuild. And practically speaking, our lives are in very different places now. He nodded, accepting this reality. I understand. For what it's worth, I'm proud of who you've become, Alexandra. Not because you've proven me wrong, though you certainly have, but because you've built something meaningful entirely on your own terms. The words settled into the space between us, neither demanding response nor seeking absolution, simply stating a truth too long unacknowledged. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A nurse entered, followed by a doctor in surgical scrubs. Mr. Wells, it's time for your follow-up evaluation, the doctor announced, then noticed me. Family can return in about 30 minutes. I stood, gathering my purse. That's fine. I need to make some calls anyway. My father caught my hand before I could leave. Will you come back? After the evaluation? The question contained no demand, no expectation, only hope. 5 years ago, he had declared me no longer his daughter. Today, he was asking permission to be my father again. I'll come back, I promised. We still have a lot to discuss. In the hospital cafeteria, I made the calls Ryan had flagged as urgent, efficiently handling business matters while my father underwent his evaluation. I spoke with the detective investigating Caroline, providing details about the fraudulent surgery claim and the forged disinheritance papers. I contacted my attorney about recovery proceedings. I confirmed a meeting with our largest client for the following week. Throughout these conversations, I maintained the professional composure that had become my hallmark, compartmentalizing personal turmoil to focus on immediate tasks. Yet beneath this practiced efficiency ran a current of emotional awareness I might once have suppressed, recognition that my world was shifting in ways that demanded acknowledgement. As I finished my calls, a text arrived from Ryan. Hospital. Billing called. Payment has been fully frozen pending fraud investigation. Legal believes complete recovery likely. The news should have brought unalloyed relief. Instead, It prompted an unexpected thought. What if the money hadn't mattered after all? What if the real value of this painful episode lay not in the financial resolution but in the painful truths it had exposed? Both Caroline's deception and the possibility that my relationship with my father might not be irreparably broken? I purchased 2 cups of decent coffee from the cafeteria and headed back to the cardiac unit, using the elevator ride to organize my thoughts. When I returned to my father's room, I found him back in bed, looking tired but alert. "Good news from the doctor," he reported as I handed him the coffee. "Heart function improving steadily. If all goes well, I'll be discharged tomorrow." "That's excellent," I said, resuming my seat. "Where will you go?" "The house is still in foreclosure proceedings," he finished. "My attorney is negotiating with the bank, but realistically, I'll need to find an apartment." The practical reality of his situation struck me anew. At 62, my father was starting over. No home, no career, no wife, minimal savings. The man who had once seemed invincible was now facing a future, defined by limitation and rebuilding. "I have a colleague who manages several apartment buildings," I offered. "I could ask about availability." "That would be helpful," he acknowledged, "though my options are limited until I sort out employment. Non-practicing attorneys aren't in high demand." "What are you thinking of doing?" He smiled ruefully. "At my age, with my history, options are limited. I'm considering legal consulting, advising rather than representing. It's not the career I built, but it would utilize my experience." I nodded, impressed despite myself by his pragmatism. The father I remembered would have found such diminished circumstances intolerable. This new version, humbled but adaptable, was unfamiliar, but somehow more approachable. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," I ventured after a moment. "About building something new between us." He waited, giving me space to continue without interruption. "I'm not ready to simply forget the past 5 years," I said carefully. "The things you said, the way you cut me off completely, that can't be erased with one conversation or one apology." "I understand," he replied quietly. "But," I continued, "I'm open to the possibility of moving forward, slowly, with clear boundaries and expectations on both sides." Hope flickered in his eyes, tempered by caution. "What would that look like to you?" "Regular communication, maybe dinner once a month to start. Getting to know each other as the people we are now, not the people we were then." I paused, then added the most important condition. "And complete honesty. No more secrets, no more judgments disguised as concern." "I can work with that," my father agreed, relief evident in his voice. "And I promise to respect your boundaries, Alexandra. Your life, your choices, they're yours, not mine to direct or critique." The promise contained an implicit recognition of where we had gone wrong before, his inability to accept my independence, my different path. Whether he could maintain this new perspective remained to be seen, but his willingness to acknowledge the core issue felt like a significant step. As I left the hospital that afternoon, commitments made for further conversation and practical assistance, I felt neither the triumph of vindication nor the vulnerability of reconciliation, but something more nuanced, the quiet satisfaction of addressing an old wound with the wisdom and strength I'd earned through years of independence. My father had once deemed me worthless because I hadn't followed his prescribed path. Now, the very independence he had rejected had given me the strength to consider rebuilding our relationship on new, more equal terms. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was it bitter. Some inheritances I was beginning to understand weren't passed down but built from the ground up, constructed from the raw materials of disappointment, resilience, and the courage to face painful truths with clear eyes. As I drove back to my office, ready to immerse myself in the business I had created despite all predictions of failure, I felt more settled in my own worth than ever before. Not because my father had finally acknowledged it, but because I had proven it to the one person whose opinion truly mattered, myself. The journey ahead, both professional and personal, wouldn't be without challenges. But I had built something valuable from nothing once before. With the right foundation, perhaps I could do so again. 1 month after my father's hospital discharge, I stood in the lobby of a modest apartment building in West Side Heights, carrying a housewarming gift, a potted peace lily and a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling cider, as alcohol was still restricted during his cardiac recovery. The building was clean and well-maintained, if not luxurious, with rentals specifically marketed to seniors and those seeking quieter living arrangements. My colleague's management company had found a 1-bedroom unit within my father's new budget constraints. I checked the unit number again, 307, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Our interactions over the past month had been cautious but consistent. 2 dinners at neutral restaurants, several phone calls, and my assistance with various practical aspects of his transition. Today marked my first visit to his new home, a symbolic crossing of a boundary I'd been careful to maintain. My father answered my knock promptly, dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt rather than the impeccable suits that had once been his uniform. The apartment behind him was sparsely furnished but orderly, with a few familiar pieces salvaged from the family home mixed with new, more modest acquisitions. "Alexandra," he greeted me warmly. "Thank you for coming." I handed him the gifts. Housewarming traditions. The plant is supposed to bring peace and the cider prosperity, or so the florist claimed. "Both welcome additions," he replied, placing them on a small side table. "Would you like the tour? It won't take long." The apartment was compact but functional, a combined living and dining area, a serviceable kitchen, a bedroom just large enough for a queen-sized bed, and a bathroom renovated to accommodate senior safety features. What struck me most was the wall of bookshelves in the living room, filled with familiar volumes from my childhood home. "You kept the books," I observed, running my fingers along the spines of literary classics my mother had collected. "Of course," my father replied. "When the bank took the house, I was allowed to remove personal items. These were non-negotiable." He hesitated, then added, "I saved your mother's things too, and anything of yours that remained. They're in storage until I determine a more permanent situation." The consideration surprised me. During our estrangement, I'd assumed he'd disposed of all remnants of our previous life, just as he'd seemingly disposed of his connection to me. "Thank you," I said simply, genuinely touched by this evidence that he had preserved our shared past despite everything. We settled in the living area with cups of tea. Another change, as my father had once exclusively drunk coffee, dismissing tea as flavored water. The cardiac restrictions had forced numerous small adjustments to his daily habits. "How is the consulting progressing?" I asked, noting the laptop and legal pads on his small dining table. "Slowly," he admitted. "I've secured 2 clients who need guidance on complex estate matters. Not enough for financial stability yet, but a beginning. Your marketing suggestions have been helpful." I'd offered basic advice on building his consulting website and creating a professional profile, simple strategies that had served me well in my early business days. My father, once dismissive of internet marketing gimmicks, had implemented every suggestion with careful attention. "And the legal proceedings with Caroline?" I ventured, approaching the subject that still remained somewhat raw for both of us. His expression tightened briefly. "Moving forward. The divorce filing was unopposed. She's disappeared, along with Melody. The detective believes they've moved to Arizona, possibly to set up their next operation." He paused, visibly managing his anger. "The fraud investigation continues. They've identified 2 previous victims with similar experiences." "I'm sorry," I said sincerely. Despite everything, the betrayal had wounded him deeply. He shook his head. My own blindness created the opportunity for deception. That's something I'm working to understand in my counseling sessions. You're continuing with therapy? I asked, unable to hide my surprise. Weekly, he confirmed. Initially for cardiac recovery support, but now for broader issues. Understanding patterns of control, perfectionism, inability to adapt to others' choices. He met my eyes directly. The same traits that damaged our relationship. The acknowledgement hung between us. Neither accusation nor excuse, simply truth. Being recognized. I sipped my tea, allowing myself to absorb the significance of his ongoing commitment to self-examination. It's challenging, he continued after a moment. Dismantling beliefs and behaviors established over 6 decades, but necessary if I want any chance at rebuilding what matters. That takes courage, I observed quietly, examining yourself that honestly. I had an example to follow, he replied. Watching you rebuild your life after I cut you off. That demonstrated true courage. I merely had the good fortune to receive a second chance I didn't deserve. The compliment touched something vulnerable within me. For so long I'd needed his approval, then convinced myself I no longer cared about his opinion. The truth, I was realizing, lay somewhere in between. His validation wasn't necessary for my success, but his genuine recognition still held meaning. I wanted to discuss something with you, my father said, shifting slightly to reach a folder. On the side table. A legal matter requiring your input. My guard instinctively rose. What kind of legal matter? Nothing concerning, he assured me, noting my reaction. Just something I should have addressed years ago. He opened the folder, revealing official-looking documents. These are amendments to my will and financial arrangements. Obviously, there's significantly less to distribute than before, but what remains should be properly allocated. I started to protest, uncomfortable with the subject, but he held up a hand. Please, let me finish. This isn't about money. There's precious little of that left. It's about recognition. He passed me a document bearing the letterhead of a reputable law firm. I've legally re-established you as my heir and executor. More importantly, I've included this formal acknowledgement that the previous disinheritance documents were fraudulent and never represented my intentions. I scanned the document, noting the carefully worded legal language that officially negated the papers Caroline had forged. The practical impact was minimal, given my father's current financial situation, but the symbolic meaning was significant. You didn't need to do this, I said, returning the document. I know the truth now. I did need to, he countered firmly. Not for you, but for myself. To formally correct a wrong, even one I didn't directly commit. To create an official record that contradicts the lie. His insistence on this formality, this legal recognition of my place in his life, reflected the attorney's mindset that defined him even without his license to practice. For him, truth required documentation. Legitimacy demanded proper process. There's something else, he continued, retrieving a small jewelry box from his pocket. This isn't in the will because I wanted to give it to you personally. He handed me the box, which contained my mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond that had always seemed to catch the light perfectly on her hand. Catherine would want you to have this, he said, voice softening. Not necessarily for marriage, unless that's a path you choose, but as a connection to her. I've held on to it too long. I cradled the ring in my palm, unexpected tears threatening. Throughout our estrangement, I'd assumed this treasured item had been displaced by Caroline's more ostentatious jewelry, perhaps even sold during financial difficulties. Its preservation represented a thread of continuity I hadn't dared hope for. Thank you, I whispered, slipping the ring onto my right hand where it settled as if it belonged. This means more than any inheritance could. My father nodded, understanding passing between us. For a moment, we sat in comfortable silence, a new experience in our rebuilding relationship, which had thus far been filled with careful conversation and deliberate communication. "I have news as well," I said finally, tucking the ring box into my purse. "About the recovery of the hospital payment." "Good news, I hope?" "Yes," I confirmed. "The full amount has been recovered and returned to Alexandra Wells Design's accounts. The hospital's fraud investigation was remarkably effective, especially after they discovered Caroline had attempted similar schemes at 2 other medical facilities." Relief crossed my father's face. "I'm glad. That money represents your hard work, your company's future. It should never have been jeopardized by my situation." "The company would have survived regardless," I assured him. "We ran projections for worst-case scenarios, but the recovery does allow us to proceed with our expansion plans." "The second office location you mentioned?" I nodded, pleased that he had remembered this detail from our previous conversations. "We're finalizing the lease next week. It will allow us to serve clients in the western neighborhoods more effectively and hire 3 additional designers." "Impressive growth," my father observed, genuine admiration in his voice. "How many employees will that bring your total to?" 32, I replied, unable to keep pride from my voice. "Plus our regular contractors. All built in 5 years," he marveled, "from that first client in your apartment." The acknowledgement of my journey, the precise recognition of where I had started and how far I had come, felt like a balm on an old wound. My father had never asked about those early days before, had never shown interest in understanding the path I had forged. Without his support, it wasn't easy, I admitted. Especially at the beginning. There were months when I wasn't sure I could make rent, when I took design jobs that barely covered expenses because I needed the portfolio pieces. "Yet you persisted," he noted, "when many would have given up and sought safer employment." "I was too stubborn to quit," I said with a small smile. "A family trait, apparently." He chuckled, acknowledging the gentle teasing. "Indeed, though I hope you've directed that stubborn streak more wisely than I directed mine." "I've tried," I replied, learning from both positive and negative examples. A comfortable pause followed, broken when my father asked, "Have you made a decision about the Horizon position? The creative director role you mentioned?" "I turned it down yesterday," I revealed, after a lot of consideration. "May I ask why?" It seemed like a prestigious opportunity. 5 years ago, such a question would have felt like the prelude to criticism. Today, it registered as genuine curiosity, interest without judgment. It was prestigious, I acknowledged, and financially secure. But it would have changed the fundamental nature of what I've built. Alexandra Wells Design exists to provide independent creative solutions. Becoming a subsidiary of a larger corporation would have compromised that vision. My father nodded thoughtfully. "You chose autonomy over security." "I chose the path that aligned with my values," I clarified, "just as I've always tried to do, even when others didn't understand or approve." The gentle reminder of our fundamental disagreement hung between us, not as accusation but as context. The recognition that our conflict had centered on precisely this principle: my right to choose my own path according to my own values. "A wise decision," my father said after a moment. "Alignment with core values provides a different kind of security, one I failed to recognize or respect in your choices." The explicit acknowledgement, so different from the dismissiveness of 5 years ago, marked how far we had come in just 1 month of cautious rebuilding. As our visit continued, conversation flowed more naturally, touching on current events, books we'd read recently, and plans for the coming months. I found myself relaxing into this new dynamic, where my professional judgment was treated with respect and my personal choices with curiosity rather than criticism. When I finally prepared to leave, my father walked me to the door, pausing before opening it. "I've been thinking about what you said at the hospital," he ventured. "About Mom being disappointed in how we handled the past 5 years." I nodded, remembering the conversation. "She would have been," he continued, "but I think she would be proud of how we're handling the next 5 years, starting now." The observation carried with it a forward-looking optimism I hadn't expected. Not just reconciliation with the past, but anticipation of a different future. "I think she would," I agreed, touching the ring now circling my finger, one step at a time. As I left the apartment building, the late afternoon sun warm on my face, I felt a sense of equilibrium that had been absent for years. The anger that had fueled my initial determination to succeed had gradually transformed into something more sustainable, pride in my achievements for their own sake rather than as vindication against my father's judgment. Our relationship would never return to what it had been in my childhood, when I had viewed him with unquestioning admiration and sought his approval above all else. That dynamic had been irrevocably altered, but perhaps we were building something healthier in its place, a relationship between adults who recognized each other's flaws and strengths, who could disagree without rejection, who could support without controlling. The journey had been painful, the cost significant for us both. Yet standing now at this crossroads, my business thriving, my father beginning again with humility and self-awareness, I couldn't help but feel that we had each found our way to exactly where we needed to be. Not through his approval or my defiance, but through the shared recognition that worthiness came not from external validation, but from living authentically according to one's deepest values. That, perhaps, was the most valuable inheritance of all. 6 months passed quickly, marked by milestones both professional and personal. Alexandra Wells Design officially opened its second location, a sleek, modern space in Westbridge District that perfectly captured our design aesthetic, while providing room for our expanding team. The recovery of the fraudulent hospital payment had allowed us to proceed with our growth plans on schedule, and the new office symbolized not just business success, but personal resilience. My relationship with my father continued its careful evolution. Our monthly dinners had become bi-weekly, supplemented by occasional lunches near my downtown office. Each interaction reinforced our new dynamic, one built on mutual respect rather than expectation or obligation. He asked thoughtful questions about my business decisions without offering unsolicited advice. I inquired about his consulting work without feeling responsible for his success. On a crisp autumn morning, I arrived at my original office to find Ryan waiting with an unusual expression, part excitement, part hesitation. "What is it?" I asked, accepting the coffee he handed me as we walked toward my office. "2 things," he replied. "First, the Meridian technology proposal was accepted. Full budget, timeline approved, and they want to start immediately." "That's excellent news," I said, genuinely pleased. Meridian was a major client we'd been courting for months, their project substantial enough to occupy a full design team for the next quarter. "Second," Ryan continued, following me into my office, "there's someone waiting in the conference room. He arrived about 20 minutes ago, asked to see you when you got in, says it's important." "Who is it?" "Edward Blackwell, from Blackwell and Associates." I paused, the name immediately registering. The law firm that had supposedly sent the fraudulent disinheritance papers, the firm my father had left years before. "Did he say what this is regarding?" Ryan shook his head. "Just that it concerns both you and your father, and it's urgent but not alarming." I checked my watch. My first scheduled meeting wasn't for another hour, giving me time to address this unexpected visitor. "I'll see him now," I decided. "And Ryan, would you call my father and ask if he can join us? If this involves both of us, he should be here." As Ryan left to make the call, I took a moment to collect my thoughts. Edward Blackwell had been my father's law partner for over 15 years, before their professional relationship ended. I'd met him a handful of times as a child and teenager, finding him cordial but distant, the kind of person who interacted with children as miniature adults rather than unique beings. What could he possibly want that involved both me and my father? I straightened my blazer and headed to the conference room, professional mask firmly in place. Edward Blackwell had aged since I'd last seen him, his once dark hair now completely silver, his tall frame slightly stooped. He rose as I entered, extending his hand. "Ms. Wells," he greeted me formally. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I apologize for the interruption to your morning." "Mr. Blackwell," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I've asked my father to join us, as I understand this matter concerns him as well." Something like relief flickered across Blackwell's face. "Yes, that's most appropriate. Is he, well?" "Recovering," I answered simply. "He should be here shortly." We engaged in careful small talk while waiting, observations about the office design, polite questions about my business, equally polite inquiries about his continued legal practice. Throughout this conversation, I sensed Blackwell's assessment, as if he were calibrating his approach based on my responses. 20 minutes later, my father arrived. He looked considerably healthier than he had in the hospital 6 months ago. His color good, his movements more energetic. The cardiac rehabilitation and lifestyle changes had clearly benefited him physically, while the therapy sessions had contributed to a subtle but significant shift in his demeanor. Less rigid, more present. His expression showed surprise when he saw his former partner. "Edward, this is unexpected." "Harrison." Blackwell nodded, an undercurrent of tension evident in their exchange. "Thank you for coming. This concerns you both, and I thought it best to address it directly." At my gesture, we all took seats around the conference table. I noticed my father positioning himself adjacent to me rather than opposite, a small but meaningful indication of our realigned relationship. "I'll come straight to the point," Blackwell began, opening a sleek leather portfolio. "I've recently discovered something disturbing involving Caroline, your former firm, and the fraudulent documents Alex received." My father stiffened slightly beside me. "Go on." 6 months ago, when the fraud allegations against Caroline became public, I initiated an internal review of all materials involving your accounts, Harrison. Standard procedure when a former partner faces potential legal issues that might implicate the firm. "Prudent," my father acknowledged. "During this review, we discovered that approximately 8 months ago, someone accessed our document templates and letterhead through our system. Digital forensics traced the access to Caroline's personal device. She forged documents using your firm's materials," I said, connecting the obvious dots. "Yes, but that's not the most concerning part," Blackwell continued. "The access occurred through legitimate credentials, specifically credentials belonging to William Tanner, one of our junior associates." My father frowned. "William Tanner? I don't recall." "You wouldn't," Blackwell interrupted. "He joined the firm after your departure. However, he's also Caroline's nephew, her sister's son." The revelation landed heavily. This wasn't just opportunistic fraud, it was coordinated deception involving family connections. "We've since terminated Tanner's employment and reported his involvement to the Bar Association," Blackwell continued. "But in investigating this breach, we discovered something else, something that directly impacts both of you." He removed several documents from his portfolio, sliding them across the table. "These are copies of transaction records from the firm's client trust account, dating back 5 years. They show a series of unauthorized withdrawals and subsequent deposits, money temporarily removed, then replaced." My father's face paled. "The client funds I was accused of mishandling." "Yes," Blackwell confirmed. "At the time, the evidence pointed to your involvement, Harrison. You accepted responsibility, surrendered your license, and we parted ways. However, our forensic accounting has uncovered that these transactions occurred when you were demonstrably elsewhere. In court, at client meetings, even on that trip to Vancouver for your niece's wedding. What are you saying, Edward? My father asked, his voice unnaturally controlled. I'm saying you weren't responsible for those transactions, Harrison. Caroline was. She used your credentials, your authority, while establishing an alibi for you. The pattern aligns perfectly with her documented activities over that period. I watched my father absorb this information, emotions crossing his face in rapid succession. Shock, confusion, anger, and finally, a profound grief. You were set up, I said quietly, reaching to touch his arm. From the beginning. It appears so, Blackwell confirmed. The financial manipulation began much earlier than anyone realized. Caroline was playing a long game, first undermining your professional standing, then isolating you from support systems, including Alex, and finally extracting maximum financial benefit before moving on. Why are you bringing this to us now? I asked, instinctively protective as I watched my father struggle with these revelations. Blackwell straightened, his expression solemn. 2 reasons. First, professional integrity. As Harrison's former partner, I owe him the truth about what happened under our firm's roof. Second, practical considerations. He produced another document. This is a formal statement from Blackwell and Associates acknowledging that Harrison Wells was not responsible for the misappropriation of client funds. We've submitted this to the State Bar Association with a recommendation for reconsideration of his case. My father looked up sharply. You're suggesting I could get my license back? It's possible, Blackwell replied cautiously. Not certain. The bar will conduct its own investigation, and there's the matter of your voluntary surrender. But this evidence significantly changes the narrative. For a moment, no one spoke. The implications were enormous, not just the restoration of professional standing, but the potential undoing of the cascade of losses that had followed: financial stability, reputation, self-respect. There's one more thing, Blackwell added, his tone softening slightly. The firm would like to make restitution for our failure to identify this situation earlier. We should have investigated more thoroughly before accepting your resignation, Harrison. What kind of restitution? I asked, immediately wary of financial entanglements. A consulting position to start, Blackwell replied, with the option to return as counsel if your license is reinstated. The compensation would be commensurate with your experience, including consideration of the earnings lost during this period. I watched my father carefully, concerned about how he might respond to this sudden reversal of fortune. The man I had known 5 years ago would have either embraced the opportunity with unquestioning enthusiasm or rejected it with stubborn pride. The person beside me now did neither. I appreciate the offer, Edward, he said measured, and the effort to correct the record. But I'll need time to consider what this means and what path makes sense going forward. My circumstances and priorities have changed significantly. Blackwell appeared momentarily taken aback by this measured response, having clearly expected either immediate acceptance or outright rejection. He recovered quickly, gathering his documents. Of course, take whatever time you need. The offer remains open. He handed my father a business card. Call me when you've decided. And Harrison. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about how things unfolded. After Blackwell departed, my father and I remained in the conference room, the weight of these revelations settling around us. I waited, giving him space to process, to formulate his thoughts without pressure. 5 years, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. 5 years based on a lie. You couldn't have known, I offered. Her deception was remarkably thorough. No, I could have known, he countered, meeting my gaze directly. If I'd been less arrogant, less certain of my own infallibility. I accepted responsibility without demanding a complete investigation because I couldn't conceive of being manipulated so effectively. The self-awareness in this assessment, so different from the defensive posture he might once have adopted, struck me forcefully. "What will you do?" I asked. "About Blackwell's offer?" My father leaned back in his chair, considering. "I'm not sure. 6 months ago, I would have grasped at any opportunity to reclaim my old life. Now." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Now, I'm not convinced that life was as fulfilling as I once believed. The status, the income, certainly. But the purpose? You were a respected attorney," I reminded him. "You helped people." "Sometimes," he acknowledged, "but often I was simply facilitating wealth transfer or corporate maneuvering. My consulting work these past months, helping families understand complex estate matters, guiding small business owners through regulatory challenges, has felt more directly meaningful." He turned the business card over in his hands, studying it thoughtfully. "Whatever I decide about Blackwell's offer, I won't allow it to jeopardize what we've rebuilt. 5 years ago, I prioritized career over family. I won't make that mistake again." The declaration, so contrary to the value system he had once espoused and tried to impose on me, demonstrated how profoundly his perspective had shifted. The man who had once deemed me worthless for prioritizing passion over pragmatism was now questioning his own former priorities. "We should celebrate," I suggested impulsively. "Not necessarily Blackwell's offer, but the vindication. Knowing you weren't responsible for the financial irregularities." A small smile touched my father's lips. "What did you have in mind?" "Dinner tonight? I could cook at my place." The invitation represented another step in our evolving relationship, moving from neutral restaurant settings to the more personal space of my home. "I'd like that," he agreed. Then, with characteristic attention to practical details, "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," I replied. "And maybe that bottle of sparkling cider from your housewarming. This seems like an appropriate occasion to open it." After my father left to attend his therapy appointment, a commitment he maintained despite the morning's revelations, I returned to my office, mind whirling with possibilities. The narrative we had both accepted, of his professional disgrace, leading to financial ruin, had been fundamentally altered. Caroline's manipulation had been even more calculated than we'd realized, targeting not just his finances, but his very identity. Yet strangely, I felt no surge of righteous vindication, no satisfaction in having our suspicions confirmed. Instead, I recognized that this new information didn't change the most important aspects of our journey over the past 6 months. The growth, the healing, the recalibration of our relationship, these had emerged from the reality we had lived, regardless of the deception that had created that reality. That evening, as we shared a simple meal at my dining table, wine for me and sparkling cider for my father, I observed the man across from me with fresh eyes. Hardship had tempered him, stripping away layers of certainty and pride to reveal something more authentic beneath. Whatever decision he made about returning to law practice, he would make it from this more grounded perspective. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his glass, "about what to do with this unexpected opportunity." "And?" I prompted when he hesitated. "I'm considering a hybrid approach, accepting Blackwell's consulting position part-time, maintaining my independent practice for the community work that's become meaningful to me, and pursuing license reinstatement without rushing back into full practice." "That sounds thoughtful," I observed. "Balanced. A concept I'm still learning," he acknowledged with a self-deprecating smile. "Along with accepting that life rarely offers clear villains and heroes. Caroline's deception was inexcusable, but my own rigidity and arrogance created fertile ground for it to flourish. As did my stubborn refusal to consider your perspective on my career choices," I added, recognizing my own contribution to our estrangement. we both have growth opportunities. My father raised his glass in a small toast. To growth opportunities, then, and to second chances, professional and personal, that neither of us anticipated 6 months ago. As we clinked glasses, I felt the weight of my mother's ring on my right hand, its gold warmed by my skin. The simple band had witnessed our family's journey, love, loss, estrangement, and now cautious rebuilding. What would Mom think of all this? I wondered aloud, something I'd never have asked during our estrangement. My father considered the question seriously. Catherine had an extraordinary ability to see silver linings without denying storm clouds. I think she would acknowledge the pain of these years while celebrating where they've ultimately led us. Which is where, exactly? I asked, genuinely curious about his perception. To a place of greater authenticity, he replied without hesitation. You, building a business aligned with your values rather than others' expectations. Me, recognizing that status and control are poor substitutes for connection and purpose. Both of us, learning to relate as the adults we actually are, not the roles we once played. The thoughtfulness of his response, so different from the prescriptive certainty that had once characterized his communication, reinforced how far we had come. As the evening continued, our conversation ranged widely, from business challenges to consulting opportunities, from memories of my mother to cautious plans for the coming holidays. Throughout, I was struck by the ease developing between us. Not the unquestioning closeness of our pre-estrangement relationship, but something potentially more durable because it acknowledged our differences rather than suppressing them. When my father finally prepared to leave, he paused at the door, an uncharacteristic hesitation in his manner. Alexandra, he began, using my full name with deliberate significance. Regardless of what happens with the legal reinstatement or Blackwell's offer, I want you to know something. The greatest recovery of these past months hasn't been professional or financial. It's been reconnecting with you. Seeing the remarkable woman you've become, not despite my absence, but perhaps partly because of it. The acknowledgement, delivered, without expectation of response or absolution, touched me deeply. For years, I had measured my success partly as vindication against his judgment. Now, we were both recognizing that my independence had been necessary for my authentic development, just as his losses had forced growth he might otherwise have avoided. "Good night, Dad," I replied simply, using the familiar term I had carefully avoided during our initial reconnection. His smile, warm, genuine, untinged by the criticism or expectation I had once constantly perceived, confirmed what I already knew. We were building something new, not recovering something lost. And perhaps that was the most valuable outcome of all from Caroline's devastating deception. As I closed the door behind him, I felt a sense of alignment I had rarely experienced. My professional success, my personal growth, and my family relationships all moving in coherent, authentic directions. Not because everything was perfect, or all wounds fully healed, but because the foundation now rested on truth rather than illusion, on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. The father who had once deemed me worthless had discovered my value through his own loss. And I, who had once defined myself in opposition to his judgment, had found the confidence to engage with him as an equal, neither seeking his approval nor rejecting his perspective outright. Some inheritances, it seemed, emerged only when everything else was stripped away. And sometimes what appeared to be catastrophic loss created space for more meaningful gain. If one had the courage to rebuild with intention, rather than simply attempting to recover what was lost. With this understanding settled comfortably within me, I returned to my home office to review design proposals for the following day's client meetings, gratified by the knowledge that my professional success now stood entirely on its own merits, neither diminished by my father's criticism, nor defined by vindication against it. Whatever challenges the future held, for my business, for my father's potential return to legal practice, for our continuing familial rebuilding, I would face them from this place of hard-won authenticity. Not as the worthless daughter seeking validation, nor as the rebellious entrepreneur proving a point, but simply as Alexandra Wells, businesswoman, daughter, and architect of her own destiny. 1 year after my father's hospital stay, Alexandra Wells Design had become a regional powerhouse in brand strategy. Our client roster had expanded to include 3 Fortune 500 companies. Our team had grown to 42 full-time employees, and we had relocated our main headquarters to a stunning converted warehouse in the city's revitalized arts district. Success by any conventional measure had been achieved. My personal life had seen equally significant transformations. The cautious reconnection with my father had deepened into a relationship I would never have imagined possible during our years of estrangement. We maintained our twice-monthly dinners, now alternating between our homes rather than neutral restaurants. He had returned to legal practice in a limited capacity, working 3 days a week at Blackwell & Associates while continuing his independent consulting for individuals and small businesses the remaining time. The State Bar Association had reinstated his license 6 months ago, following a thorough investigation that officially cleared him of wrongdoing in the client fund matters. The reinstatement ceremony had been small but meaningful, and I had sat in the front row, witnessing his professional redemption with genuine pride. On a Wednesday morning in late spring, I arrived at the office to find Ryan waiting with our daily briefing notes and his characteristic efficiency. 2 unexpected developments, he announced as we walked toward my office. First, the Westmark Foundation called. They want to discuss sponsoring a design scholarship program with us as the administrative partner. That's excellent, I replied, genuinely pleased. I had been exploring ways to formalize our company's commitment to developing young design talent, particularly from underrepresented communities. External funding would accelerate those plans considerably. Second, Ryan continued, Time Business Quarterly wants to interview you for their Women Redefining Success issue. The focus would be on building a values-driven enterprise rather than simply chasing profit margins. I paused at my office door, surprised by this opportunity. TBQ was a prestigious publication with significant reach among business leaders and entrepreneurs. Their features typically highlighted established executives from major corporations, not founders of mid-sized creative agencies. Did they explain why they selected me? I asked. Ryan handed me a printed email. According to their editor, they're particularly interested in your journey from rejection to recognition, building something meaningful despite initial setbacks. I smiled at the diplomatic phrasing. You mean being disowned by my father and then rescuing him from a fraudulent medical scheme? Their research department is apparently quite thorough, Ryan acknowledged with a small smile. They're framing it as a comeback story with broader applications for entrepreneurs facing personal and professional obstacles. I considered the opportunity thoughtfully. For years, I had focused exclusively on building my business, deliberately keeping my personal story separate from my professional brand. This interview would inevitably blend those boundaries, making public a journey I had largely kept private. I'll think about it, I decided. Schedule a call with their editor tomorrow so I can understand their angle more clearly. The day proceeded with its usual rhythm of client calls, design reviews, and strategy sessions. Around noon, I received a text from my father. Free for lunch? Need your perspective on something important. We met at Riverfront Park, a peaceful green space midway between our respective offices. My father arrived carrying a small cooler containing sandwiches from the deli we both favored, along with sparkling water and fresh fruit, a far cry from the heavy restaurant meals that had once been his preference. This is a nice surprise, I commented as we settled on a bench overlooking the water. though I sense there's more than lunch on the agenda. My father smiled, the expression now coming more naturally to him than it had a year ago. You always could read situations accurately. Yes, I wanted to discuss something with you before making a decision. He handed me a sandwich and took one for himself. Blackwell has offered me full partnership again. That's significant, I observed, understanding immediately why he'd wanted to discuss this in person. How do you feel about it? Conflicted, he admitted candidly. On one hand, it represents complete professional restoration. Everything I lost has been returned. The status, the income potential, the influence in legal circles. But, I prompted, hearing the reservation in his voice. But full partnership means full commitment. 60-hour weeks, high-pressure cases, corporate priorities. He took a thoughtful bite of his sandwich. I'm not convinced that's the life I want to return to, now that I've experienced alternatives. I considered his situation carefully. What alternatives are you considering? I've been developing a concept for a legal clinic focused on elder advocacy, he explained, enthusiasm entering his voice. Working with seniors on estate planning, protecting them from predatory schemes, helping them navigate healthcare directives, the work I've found most meaningful these past months. That sounds perfectly aligned with your experience and recent perspective shifts, I noted. What's holding you back? Financial pragmatism, he acknowledged. The clinic would require startup funding, office space, support staff. The Blackwell position offers immediate stability and resources. I watched a small group of ducks navigate the river currents, their seemingly effortless progress belying the constant adjustments they made beneath the surface. The image seemed oddly appropriate to our discussion. Would you be happy returning to corporate law full-time? I asked directly. Not just satisfied or financially secure, but genuinely fulfilled. My father considered the question with the careful reflection that had become characteristic of him this past year. No, he finally concluded. I'd be exchanging meaningful work for status and security, repeating old patterns rather than applying what I've learned through loss. Then perhaps the real question isn't whether to accept Blackwell's offer, but how to make the clinic financially viable, I suggested. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. That's a reframing I hadn't fully considered, approaching it as a business challenge rather than a binary choice. Which is precisely how I approached Alexandra Wells' design in those early days, I reminded him. Not, can I create this company? But how can I create this company despite limited resources? My father nodded slowly, a new appreciation evident in his expression. You've become quite the strategist, Alexandra. I learned from watching both your successes and your setbacks, I replied honestly, and from navigating my own. We finished our lunch, discussing practical considerations for his proposed clinic, potential funding sources, minimal viable operation costs, phased implementation approaches. The conversation flowed with a collaborative energy that would have been unimaginable during our estrangement. Each of us contributing insights from our respective experiences without attempting to dominate the discussion. As we prepared to return to our offices, my father hesitated, then asked, "What would you think about making this a joint venture?" "The clinic?" I clarified, surprised by the suggestion. "Yes. Not as a legal partner. That wouldn't make sense, with your design focus. But as a business strategy consultant, helping structure the operation, developing the brand identity, creating materials that connect with seniors and their families." The proposal caught me entirely off guard. My father had never suggested working together professionally, not even during my childhood when other parents routinely imagined their children following in their career footsteps. "You've built something remarkable with Alexandra Wells' design," he continued. "Applied those skills to your own vision. I'm suggesting a collaboration that leverages your expertise while allowing me to focus on the legal services. a true partnership between equals. The concept was intriguing. My company had established systems that could efficiently support a new venture without compromising our existing client commitments. The elder advocacy focus aligned with values I personally supported, and the opportunity to work alongside my father as a professional equal rather than a disappointing subordinate held undeniable appeal. I'd need to consider how it would integrate with my current operations, I said carefully, and we would need clear parameters about decision-making authority, resource allocation, and conflict resolution. My father smiled. Precisely the thoughtful analysis I would expect. Take whatever time you need to evaluate the proposition. There's no pressure, Alexandra. Whether we work together or separately, I respect the path you've created. We parted with a brief hug, another evolution in our rebuilding relationship, and I returned to my office with my thoughts in productive turmoil. The possibility of collaborating professionally with my father represented a complete reversal of our previous dynamic. Once, he had dismissed my business acumen and creative vision as worthless. Now, he actively sought my expertise and partnership. Later that afternoon, as I reviewed design mock-ups for a tech startup's brand refresh, Ryan knocked on my office door with an urgent expression. The Time Business Quarterly editor is online. 2, he informed me. I know your call was scheduled for tomorrow, but she's particularly eager to discuss the feature today if possible. I considered declining, but found myself curious about the publication's specific interest in my story. I'll take it. And Ryan? Could you pull together some preliminary information on elder advocacy organizations, market positioning, branding approaches, communication strategies? It's for a potential new project. After Ryan left, I picked up the phone. Alexandra Wells speaking. Ms. Wells, this is Vanessa Morales from TBQ. Thank you for taking my call ahead of schedule. The editor's voice was warm but professional. We're finalizing our Women Redefining Success issue, and your story has captured our team's imagination. I appreciate your interest, I replied, though I'm curious about what aspects of my journey you find most relevant for your readers. 3 elements in particular, Morales explained. First, your resilience in building a thriving business after personal rejection. Second, your decision to help your father despite his previous treatment of you. And third, how that situation ultimately led to both professional growth and family healing. I considered her framing carefully. Those are indeed central aspects of my experience, though the reality contains more complexity than a simple redemption narrative. That complexity is precisely what makes your story valuable, Morales countered. Success narratives often present simplified trajectories. Visionary has idea, overcomes obvious obstacle, achieves predetermined goal. Your journey demonstrates that authentic success often emerges from navigating messy, painful situations without clear roadmaps. Her perspective resonated unexpectedly. Throughout my business development, I had focused primarily on forward momentum, rarely pausing to recognize how the painful catalyst of my father's rejection had ultimately fostered greater self-reliance and clearer value alignment. There's another aspect of your story that particularly interests us, Morales continued. The evolution of your definition of success itself. From seeking external validation to creating impact on your own terms. You've done thorough research, I observed, impressed by her insight. We take our profiles seriously, she confirmed, which is why we're offering not just an interview but a cover feature. Your story embodies the fundamental shift happening in how success is measured, from purely financial metrics to more holistic assessments of purpose, impact, and personal fulfillment. The offer was significant. Cover features in TBQ typically generated substantial business interest and opened doors to speaking engagements, board positions, and expanded client opportunities. From a purely strategic perspective, accepting made obvious sense for Alexandra Wells Design's continued growth. Yet my hesitation stemmed not from business considerations, but personal ones. Sharing my journey publicly would mean exposing vulnerabilities I had carefully protected, acknowledging pain I had channeled into determination, and revealing the reconciliation that remained a private, precious development. "I'll need to discuss this with my father before making a decision," I told Morales. "Given the personal nature of the story, his perspective matters to me." "Of course," she replied. "Family consideration reflects exactly the values-based approach we're highlighting. Just let us know by Friday if possible, as we're finalizing our production schedule." After ending the call, I sat quietly for several moments, contemplating how completely my priorities had evolved. 5 years ago, my father's opinion had been simultaneously all-important and deeply resented, a contradiction that had fueled both my drive to succeed and my emotional turmoil. Now, consulting him represented neither dependence nor defiance, but simple respect for his role in a shared narrative. I texted him, "Need to discuss another opportunity. Dinner at my place tonight." His reply came quickly, "I'll bring dessert. 7 p.m. works." That evening, as we sat in my dining room sharing a meal I had prepared between client calls, I explained the TBQ opportunity and my mixed feelings about making our journey public. "This could significantly elevate Alexandra Wells Design's profile," my father noted. "From a business perspective, it seems advantageous." "Yes," I agreed. "But it would also mean sharing personal details about our estrangement and reconciliation. I wanted to ensure you're comfortable with that level of transparency." My father considered this thoughtfully, the deliberation that had once manifested as rigid judgment now expressing itself as careful reflection. "There was a time when I would have rejected such public acknowledgement of failure or vulnerability," he admitted. "Now, I wonder if our story might actually help others struggling with similar situations." "That's what Morales suggested," I confirmed. "She believes the evolution of our relationship reflects broader shifts in how success itself is defined." "And how do you define success now, Alexandra?" my father asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "After everything you've built and everything we've experienced?" The question deserved careful consideration. I thought about the company I had created from nothing, the team that had grown around my vision, the clients whose businesses had thrived through our collaborative work. I thought about the financial security I had achieved, the professional recognition I had earned, the creative fulfillment I experienced daily. But I also thought about the more intangible developments, the relationships restored, the authenticity discovered, the alignment between external achievement and internal values. I define success as creation rather than reaction, I finally answered. Building something meaningful that reflects my true values, rather than simply proving others wrong or meeting external expectations. It's about impact, purpose, and integrity, not just achievement. My father nodded slowly. A wisdom I wish I had understood decades earlier. Perhaps sharing our story might help others find that understanding without requiring the same painful path. "Then you're comfortable with the interview?" "More than comfortable," he affirmed. "I'm proud of the journey you've navigated and honored to be part of its current chapter, despite my role in its painful beginning. The world could benefit from your perspective, Alexandra." His endorsement, offered without condition or attempt to control the narrative, confirmed how profoundly our relationship had transformed. What once would have been an opportunity for him to reassert authority had become an occasion for genuine support. "There's something else," I added, transitioning to the subject that had occupied my thoughts since lunch. "I've been considering your proposal about the legal clinic collaboration." "And?" he prompted, his expression carefully neutral, allowing me space to reach my own conclusion without pressure. "I'd like to explore it further," I said. "Not as a personal favor, but as a strategic opportunity that aligns with my company's capabilities and my personal values. If we establish clear parameters and responsibilities, I believe we could create something meaningful together. The smile that spread across my father's face contained equal parts satisfaction and wonder, the expression of someone receiving an unexpected gift they hadn't dared hope for. "I never imagined we would reach this point," he admitted. "Working together as equals, each bringing distinct strengths to a shared vision." "Neither did I acknowledged. "But perhaps that's the most valuable lesson from everything we've experienced, that growth often takes us to places we couldn't initially envision, opening possibilities we never considered." As we continued our dinner, discussing practical aspects of both the TBQ interview and the clinic collaboration, I felt a deep sense of alignment that transcended simple happiness or success. The path that had begun with devastating rejection had led through determined independence to this unexpected integration. Professional achievement complemented by personal reconciliation, each made richer by the other's presence. The father who had once deemed me worthless now valued not only my personal qualities, but my professional capabilities. And I, who had once defined myself primarily in opposition to his judgment, now engaged with him from a place of secure self-knowledge, neither seeking his approval nor rejecting his perspective outright. Whatever challenges lay ahead, in business growth, in our collaborative venture, in the continuing evolution of our relationship, we would face them not as adversaries or even as separate individuals, but as partners who had earned mutual respect through the difficult, beautiful work of transformation. And that, perhaps, was the most motivational aspect of our journey. The recognition that no relationship is irredeemably broken when both parties commit to authentic growth, and no setback is permanently defeating when viewed as an opportunity for redirection rather than merely as loss. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.